I don't think it's much of a hot take to say that MMA fighters are intimidating. These are people that train every single day to physically harm with lethal efficiency, using only the bodies they've honed into finely tuned death machines. But there are some fighters amongst the ranks that, be it for their sheer physicality, their demeanor, or the sense we get that they just cannot be stopped, go far beyond the expected level of intimidation and move into a category of downright terrifying. And today, we're going to count down those fighters who left their opponents and the fans waking up in the middle of the night with a cold sweat. I'm Tommy from MMA On Point, and these are the top 10 most intimidating fighters in MMA history. Number 10. Chuck Liddell. Chuck Liddell is a bizarre mixture of someone that looks like you'd want to have a beer with and watch football, but also someone you would not want to see in a dark alley in the middle of the night. Liddell is an intimidating presence and in many ways embodies exactly what people expect a cage fighter to look like, especially during the everything was barbed wire and skulls era of the sport during the 2000s. He had a mohawk, he looked like an athlete, but at the same time he looked a bit like a barroom brawler. He was rough around the edges. Chuck didn't have a traditional looking stance, he used his wrestling predominantly to keep a fight standing so he could punch you in the face more, and more than anything, more than his look, more than his intimidating stare downs, his fearlessness, what made Chuck Liddell so intimidating was that he was a finisher. He was going to put your lights out, and he was going to do so with a barrage of nasty strikes that were going to hurt. During his legendary run from 2004 to 2006, Liddell TKO'd every single opponent he fought, stringing together 7 finishes in a row. It just seemed like there was nothing you could do. He wasn't going to let you do what you wanted, he was going to force you into his game and then punish you for playing it. The raw emotion in Liddell's celebrations after his brutal finishes only added to the intimidation factor. Chuck in his prime represented pain, and if you fought him in that era, you were going to feel it, and you were damn sure going to be intimidated by it beforehand. Number 9. Rampage Jackson. All fighters are strong, all fighters are athletes, but not everyone can destroy someone on the scale of Rampage Jackson in his prime. And probably no moment better demonstrated that than when he knocked Ricardo Arona out cold with a vicious slam at Pride Critical Countdown 2004. You're not supposed to be able to do that, but Rampage made it look as easy as a powerbomb in pro wrestling. Jackson was violence personified during his prime in Pride. He was fun and lighthearted outside of the ring, but as soon as it was time to make that walk, the chain was on, the face was mean, and the howl was terrifying. If he hit you with anything solid, you were going to sleep. He knew it and his opponents knew it. Once Rampage was brought to the UFC, he quickly made it known to fans as well the type of power they were dealing with when he destroyed the beloved Chuck Liddell within a round at UFC 71, ending his epic run as light heavyweight champion. Now, he had TKO'd Chuck in Pride 4 years earlier, but some fans in the States were unaware. They knew now though. His opponents always knew, of course, most refusing to engage Rampage in boxing range, a great example of that being John Jones in their UFC 135 bout. The champion was not taking any chances with Jackson's power, at times almost running out of range. Even now in his 40s, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone willing to trade with Jackson. They say power is the last thing to go in a fighter, so rest assured for as long as Jackson continues to fight, he will be intimidating his opponents. Number 8. Uberim. The heavyweight division has seen its fair share of absolute freaks, and there is no doubt that the sheer size of some of them can be intimidating. It doesn't make any sense when an athlete is at the upper limit of 265 pounds and has abs, but these freaks do exist. Brock Lesnar is a great example of a fighter whose body just doesn't make any sense, but there was an even freakier someone who turned that body into a pile of rubble, and that someone was of course Alistair Overeem. But not just any version of Alistair Overeem, this was Uberim. Yes, from about 2007 to 2011, heavyweights trembled at the sight of Alistair Overeem, who had transformed his 6'4" frame into something that cannot be explained by science. Well, maybe science could explain it. Look, whether Reem was just eating a lot of horse meat at that time, or other factors were at play, I'm not here to speculate. What is certain of this era, though, was that Overeem was the freakiest of all freaks. Bob Sapp doesn't count. His early fights were mostly horrible size mismatches, and then he went on to lose anytime he was sneezed on. Uberim, on the other hand, dominated, going on an 11-fight tear, winning the Strikeforce heavyweight title, the Dream heavyweight title, and then coming over to the UFC and destroying Brock Lesnar. In those 11 fights, Uberim saw 10 finishes. There was nobody scarier during that era than Reem. He looked like he would go on to be unbeaten forever. But much like the Super Shredder pulling the dock down on himself in the Turtles movie, Uberim too defeated Uberim. Right before he was scheduled to fight Junior Dos Santos for the heavyweight title at UFC 146, Reem's TE ratio was more than double what was allowed, and we wouldn't see him in the cage again until 2013. By that time, Uberim was dead and gone, but for 4 years there was one heavyweight nobody wanted to face, and that was Alistair Overeem. Number 7. Rumble Johnson. There have been many versions of Anthony Rumble Johnson, and each new iteration seems to be scarier than the previous. He's like that Dragon Ball Z joke, we haven't even seen Rumble Johnson's final form. And while he was a fairly dynamic and devastating welterweight, yes, that's right, Johnson somehow made 170 pounds during his career, the most intimidating Rumble Johnson is without a doubt the light heavyweight version. Making his debut at 205 after being cut from the UFC, Johnson would win 10 fights in the division, only losing to champion Daniel Cormier after making his return to the organization. During that run, he would amass 9 KO TKO finishes, some of which were absolutely brutal. Poor Glover Teixeira. Even in his first loss to Daniel Cormier, his reputation as someone with power that doesn't even make sense was on display as a single punch sent champion Cormier flying through the air like a cartoon. There have been plenty of strikers at 205 that you didn't want to get hit by, but when it comes to raw, intimidating power, you would be hard-pressed to find anyone that tops Rumble Johnson in that division, possibly the entire sport. Now, we never saw a fight between Rumble and John Jones, but I would imagine it would have been much like the Rampage fight. Jones would know to steer clear of that kind of power, and for the unfortunate souls who were locked in the cage with Johnson, I'm sure even up to the moment he knocked them unconscious, the fear of that power was at the forefront of their mind. Number 6. CRIS Cyborg. I once joked that I felt like I should call the police after watching one of CRIS Cyborg's fights, and I think that says just about everything you need to know about what makes Cyborg so intimidating. Over the course of her 13-year-long unbeaten run, CRIS Cyborg brutalized 21 opponents, and if you saw the final bell, you were one of the lucky few. Cyborg had 17 knockouts in 21 wins, with 11 of those stoppages coming in the first round. One of those wins was overturned due to a failed post-fight drug test, which honestly only added to her intimidation factor. Cyborg was quick and violent. She would turn it on as fast as she saw an opening and beat you until the ref didn't have a choice but to stop the fight or else end up on trial. Much like Mike Tyson's prime, the outcome of CRIS Cyborg fights were almost a foregone conclusion. It felt like every time a fight with Cyborg was announced, we were sacrificing someone to an angry god so as not to incur their wrath. Cyborg has been a minus 3,000 favorite on several occasions in her career, if that gives you any idea as to what oddsmakers were thinking about her fights. She was simply unstoppable, and on top of that, she was brutally violent. There are very few in all of sports who will ever intimidate their opponents like CRIS Cyborg. Number 5. Mirko Krokop. Right leg hospital, left leg cemetery. It's one of the all-time great lines in the history of the sport, and it's probably the most intimidating. If Mirko Krokop hit you with a head kick and it landed clean, you were going to sleep. We saw time and time again during his career that line wasn't just a throwaway. Those kicks were going to put you down. In his combined combat sports career, Krokop won via knockout 71 times. If that isn't enough to intimidate someone, I don't know what is. And as if Krokop's kickboxing prowess and general viciousness during a fight wasn't intimidating enough, he had a stoicism about him that was a bit unsettling, much like Fedor Emelianenko, but while Fedor's demeanor seemed otherworldly, Krokop at least seemed like a human being, albeit one that you imagine training in some cold, dark gym in the middle of nowhere, then going outside and kicking massive trees down with his NFL running back-sized legs. You got the sense that Krokop's stoicism derived from having seen and been through everything long before he stepped into the ring with his opponents. Listen to this call-out of Fedor before their bout in 2005.
I'm still standing, and I'm still waiting for the title fight. Emelianenko, Fedor, you are next.
Absolutely chilling. The Croatian heavyweight was an easy choice for our list. Number 4. YOEL Romero. YOEL Romero is a monster. Despite being 41 years old now, Romero looks like something straight out of a comic book. He very well might be the most athletic fighter in MMA history. YOEL looks like he could literally jump right out of the gym. His explosiveness and his physical abilities are just completely uncommon in a sport that's filled with world-class athletes. Add on top of that, he's an Olympic silver medalist in wrestling, he has world-class endurance and vicious striking. YOEL is just the embodiment of intimidation. Watch this ankle pick from a bout in 2010. That's not how physics is supposed to work. Let's not forget when he nearly decapitated Chris Weidman. Romero is like a force of nature, even in fights that he loses, like his 2 fights with middleweight champion Robert Whittaker. You get the sense that Whittaker may never be the same person again after 10 rounds with that man. People often cite his post-fight call-out of Michael Bisping as terrifying, but it's only because he is so terrifying in his fights. In any other context, that call-out was kind of funny.
I love you! See you soon, boy.
But when you know that fighting Romero is like fighting Jason Voorhees, that silly threat will turn your blood cold. YOEL Romero is simply a movie monster come to life. You're not going to kill him, you're just going to survive the ordeal. Number 3. Fedor Emelianenko. Cold is the word that probably best describes what made Fedor Emelianenko so intimidating. In a sport that is over the top with its pageantry, especially in Japan where Emelianenko's legendary career would play out for the most part, Fedor was seemingly completely removed from all that was going on around him. His walkouts would often include elaborate displays, and in a place like Saitama Super Arena that seats 36,000 people, a grand scale. But you would never know that based on Fedor's demeanor walking to the ring. You wouldn't even know that he was about to fight someone. He was just empty, cold, like he was completely unaffected by anything, that nothing could rattle him. And he fought that way. No amount of trouble ever seemed to get any sort of emotional rise out of Fedor, nor did any victory. His cold nature, along with the very little he ever spoke, made Fedor this mythological figure in the sport. It's like he wasn't even human, he was a machine that was terrifyingly efficient and quick in violence. His unbeaten run for nearly a decade only added to this intimidation. He couldn't be rattled, he couldn't be beat, and he seemingly didn't care. Fedor is the exact opposite of what makes most fighters intimidating, but that is what makes him so intimidating. Cold, mysterious, unstoppable. If those words don't strike fear into your heart, then you're simply lying, and Fedor was the embodiment of that fear in MMA for 10 years. Number 2. Anderson Silva. Anderson Silva is an anomaly. You would never know looking at him that he is one of the most feared fighters in history. He's a very pleasant guy. He's always joking around. He's always smiling and laughing. He loves to dance. His voice is disarmingly high-pitched. Physically, he's really not the scariest looking guy you've ever seen. He just kind of looks like a guy who works out pretty regularly. If you had never seen him fight, the last word that would come to your mind is intimidation. But of course, we have all seen Anderson Silva fight, and we know exactly why he is so intimidating. Anderson Silva is simply better than you. He's better than you, and there's nothing you can do about it, and he's going to throw it in your face. Throughout Anderson's run as the greatest middleweight champion of all time, we witnessed countless moments of Anderson toying with other fighters. Anderson made most of his career look like he was playing on God mode. His opponents were doing everything they could, and none of it was affecting Silva. Never a cut, never any trouble. The only fight during that run that he was dominated, he won anyway in the final minutes with a triangle choke over Chael Sonnen at UFC 117, and then in the rematch after Chael was on top all of round 1, Silva came out in round 2 like a man on fire, and with an absolute viciousness that we had not seen before, absolutely destroyed Sonnen. Silva could go from clowning around and embarrassing his opponents to brutally knocking them out in spectacular fashion in seconds. And fighters felt it. They had seen it before, and when they stepped into the cage with Anderson, they froze. Virtually no one looked good against Anderson Silva in his prime. He was going to embarrass you, he was going to destroy you, and he was going to make it look easy. If that's not intimidating, I don't know what is. Number 1. Wanderlei Silva. For fans of mixed martial arts that came around during the McGregor-Rousey era, the idea that Wanderlei Silva is intimidating might almost seem silly. The usually jovial Brazilian hasn't won since those two big stars came to prominence, and the two fights Silva did have in Bellator were well past his prime. But for fans of the sport in the early 2000s, there was no more terrifying a force in mixed martial arts than that of the Axe Murderer. During his ungodly run in Pride FC, Silva was considered one of the greatest fighters in the world, and the nearly unstoppable nature of his run was only part of what made him intimidating. Silva's legendary pre-fight stare, eyes locked on his opponent like a predator, calm but at the same time ready to destroy what was in front of him, all while his hands eerily rolled back and forth, is pure nightmare fuel. I mean, tell me alone that that wouldn't scare the shit out of someone. But it wasn't just that. Anybody can look mean, but Vandy was mean. His style of fighting was brutal, with big heavy strikes he threw in blitzes. 80% of his 35 career wins came via a finish. Silva fought like a cornered animal, and he carried that demeanor when confronted before fights as well. In an era of the sport filled with intimidating characters, Silva made nearly all of them seem like teddy bears. His fighting style, the way he carried himself at events, Silva is the textbook definition of how to intimidate, and he is without question number 1 on our list. Thanks for watching. Please give us a like and subscribe. We've got 3 new videos or more for you every single week. Let us know what you thought of the video in the comments below. Huge shout out to Tomas Welsh for editing this video together. Follow him on Instagram at BigBeatVisual. Follow On Point MMA on Twitter, and have yourself a wonderful day.
Ever compete in mixed martial arts with stunning displays of both pinpoint accuracy and his relentless pressure fighting style. After taking out both old and new challengers with flying colors, Holloway now sets his sights on a second title at UFC 236 in the lightweight division. This represents another forward step to fulfilling his dream of becoming the greatest pound